Media adaptations come in all shapes and forms with varying degrees of faithfulness to the original source material and varying degrees of quality in the final product. In terms of intellectual properties that get adapted, the original Artemis Fowl IP falls into a category that most attempts at making cinematic universes of popular modern novels and young adult book series fall, where you have a set singular canon surrounding the plot and characters, and the fan base resembles more of what you may call a fandom or potentially a smaller dedicated cult following, which is different from something like comic books, where a lot of different storylines, not all related, have been pretty standard from the beginning. So those fans are more open to a new storyline altogether and are probably already used to a bit of variation in quality. You also have literary classic adaptations like the Lord of the Rings movies, where its existence is more pervasive and often a lot older. A very key difference between these groups is that there is less stakes for the potential future and expansion of a franchise in the latter two instances, but with the first, you either have a still active or a very nostalgic fan base of people who find the IP very close and personal to their generation or themselves. People who would love to see their favorite IPs adapted into something that resembles the singular canon that they love. And so, with the recent release of the Artemis Fowl film, once again falling victim to this Hollywood cycle of terrible first film adaptations, stopping a larger movie universe in its tracks, it becomes even more frustrating to continually watch production companies acquire the rights to a large franchise only for them to fumble it immediately, an all too common occurrence that hurts both the fans and the companies that produce them. Yeah, so the Artemis Fowl movie is just impressively awful. And initially I sat down to try and write a bit more standard of a review for myself. However, after I read a bit into the history behind this production and asked myself the question, how on earth does something like this keep happening? I ended up going in a bit of a different, much angrier direction. Because the production behind this and the complete disconnect between the studio and the general audiences around Artemis Fowl is insane to me, especially coming from a well-established and at least previously well-respected company like Disney. And this isn't even a one-time exclusive thing, there is a larger picture at play here, so that's how we ended up with this video instead. Enjoy. Artemis Fowl was one of those popular book series that I somehow managed to miss as a kid, way back in my youth when I still had that joy of reading, despite it sounding like the kind of thing that would have been right up my alley, given I always liked the science fiction and fantasy type stuff more than anything else. And while those who are familiar with the book series are going to have more insight about specific changes that were made from the source material, and just how far off base they went at what appears to be a serious detriment to the final product that we are now cursed with, it's very clear, even as somebody that doesn't know much about the books, that this is the result when a highly corporatized, lowest common denominator adaptation is produced with seemingly zero care or respect given to the source material and the people who love it. Let's take a look at the development leading up to this movie, because that'll give a pretty clear picture as to why we got what we got. According to the wiki, production for this movie started back in 2001, meaning that this movie was in development almost as long as I have been alive. And it was being produced under Miramax, with Harvey Weinstein as a producer. Is this at all relevant to the actual movie? No, I just get grossed out when he pops up somewhere, especially in connection with a children's franchise. But anyways, a screenplay for this movie was apparently finalized in 2003, and clearly nothing happened with that. It remained in this volatile hell when another attempt was given a go in 2011. It was then in 2013 when Disney announced that a movie covering the events of the first two books would be happening. Then it was given an August 2019 release date, and right after that, Disney booted Weinstein's company and him off of the film entirely due to his extracurricular activities. After this, there was a small note that Colfer, referring to Eric Colfer, the author of the original book series, supported the changes made in the movies. I am almost positive that he was given a general outline of the changes made and never saw anything even close to the final product, because there is no way that somebody who spent as much time and effort in something as Colfer clearly did with his books could take a look at the Artemis Fowl movie and say that it was a good representation of his work. Absolutely not. But anyways, taking a closer look at the final product birthed from this demented womb, the movie is an hour and a half long, which is the most standard, digestible movie length you can have on the market. And as mentioned earlier, the description of this film says that it is meant to cover the events of the first 2 books. Books that aren't even thin, mind you, they are decent sized books. And I'm not saying that it is impossible that 2 books can be consolidated into a single cohesive story, but it's very odd given that this is the opposite of what we have seen other more successful filmmakers do in the past of splitting one book up into 2 movies, to at least attempt to actually flesh out the events of the film and ensure that as much of the original story and key events are presented. And here you have 2 books pushed into one short film. Sure, maybe if the movie were longer it could have been done, but it seems more clear to me that they were given the runtime that they needed to hit with very little wiggle room, and given how much of a rushed mess the final product is, it doesn't seem like that was a smart move. It almost seems to exist purely to piss off the fans with a half-assed adaptation. It's been shown that it is very difficult to try and take something broken into multiple parts, like multiple books of a series or a several seasons long TV show, and try and squeeze it into one singular movie. Try and imagine a movie covering the events of one season of Game of Thrones that's an hour and a half long. Why would you not just invest in making 2 movies that are closer to what the fans loved about the original series? Is the Artemis Fowl series that disconnected from each other that it wouldn't have made sense? All descriptions I've read have indeed said that the books are all closely related and direct sequels to each other, so that idea doesn't make a lot of sense either. When you are adapting a series or continuing a franchise, the main crowd you are going to draw in, at least initially, are fans of the original intellectual property, especially when the marketing relies on it being connected to that original name in the minds of the general audiences. And the thing about that is when you have a dedicated fan base to something you're adapting, you don't even have to make a good movie or a good show. You just have to make a faithful adaptation. Take a look at Twilight. They are crappy books with crappy movies made out of them, and yet they were successful. Why? Because the movies were so close enough to the original source material that fans of the books liked it and felt that what they were seeing was an accurate representation of an IP that they loved. So they kept going back for more and more, and the entire series managed to get made with pretty good success. It's success and popularity that I don't understand, but it is undeniable that the Twilight cinematic universe was successful. That is how low the bar is here. I am using Twilight as a positive example, but it's not just Twilight. You see something similar with The Hunger Games, Harry Potter, and Game of Thrones, though it is a shame that they just stopped that show suddenly after season 6 and we never got to see the storylines of these characters we knew and loved concluded in what surely would have been a satisfying and tasteful conclusion to send off one of the most successful and beloved television shows of all time. Jokes aside though, these are 3 franchises all varying in quality but all achieved, at least initially, success due to a respect given to the fans and the original source material. But talking more specifically about the Artemis Fowl movie, purely from a business perspective, which I don't really like to think of it like that, but companies do got a company, and it does take money to make these things, you can make 2 movies that are more faithful to the books that fans have a much higher chance of at least appreciating, and in turn potentially drawing in a new crowd after praise from these audiences come in, allowing you to continue on with the franchise and continue to make more and more of these movies, or you squeeze it into a singular product that is going to fail because of how much of a disappointment it is, killing that attempt at expanding the franchise, and you'll probably be stuck with what should have been a gold mine for producers and fans alike. But you've now destroyed any faith with the fans that it can be done, at least by Disney in this case, who I don't think are planning on selling the rights to the franchise anytime soon. Them along with every other company that are just holding on to these unfortunately mishandled IPs. And the really disappointing part is that Disney knew. They had zero faith that this movie was going to do well. They already delayed it by a year in some hope that it would do something, and then of course what's happened all in the world has happened, and they didn't even wait until the initial release date planned, which was in August 2020, to put it out onto Disney+. They just pushed it straight onto the platform early, while they keep holding on to several of their other projects where the release date has already come and gone in the hopes of eventually giving it a theatrical release. But this mess that was stuck in development hell got pushed out onto us common folk to now deal with the mental trauma of experiencing. And I understand that it would be a big financial hit to scrap a movie like this as far into the production as they got, though it is not like Disney is exactly hemorrhaging money, but now they're just going to hold on to the rights of a franchise that they have boxed themselves into a corner on. They've lost the faith of the fans and of the general consumer that they can make something worth watching out of this franchise and this name. So any future projects with it, at least for a good while, are going to be fruitless or met with strong negative reaction upon announcement. And a lot of people who wouldn't even give it another chance for a long time, talking about the long-term game, would it not make more sense to just stop for a while, get a new crew, new writers, new everything, except maybe some actors can stay, and work back on making something that will at least satisfy fans? Or if you're going to go so far off anyways, just make it something completely different and detached from the name of the franchise, because it is a massive waste otherwise. Bad movies get made all the time. But to me, there is a difference between a bad movie with popular franchise potential and a large audience base, and just a bad standalone movie. Bad standalone movies are only trying to recoup the money for making that singular film, and that is all that is at stake in those situations. But companies are treating bad franchise starters as if they are bad standalone movies, and only caring to try and recoup the money from that individual film. There is no looking ahead to the mass amounts of money and material that could be made from the rest of the franchise. Companies are shooting themselves in the foot big time when they make these terrible first installment films, and they only care to chug forward in the production machine to do whatever it takes to push it onto audiences, no matter the quality of the film. Obviously, the ultimate goal is just to make a good movie initially, and sometimes the court of public opinion sways in strange ways, and you might not always know, especially when you do make changes, as you always have to in adapting stuff. But when the writing is on the wall that a movie is terrible and is going to flop, which I already mentioned Disney clearly knew in this case, I wish more companies would pull out before release. Because we've already seen what happens repeatedly from other franchise attempts, the absolute massacre that happens to a franchise when the first installments are awful. Percy Jackson made one terrible movie that resulted in a second film performing even worse, and that killed the whole franchise in 2013. And only recently, 7 years later, have I seen any talk for a revival attempt. And most of that has been in the form of a TV show. The Fifth Wave, my favorite book as a young adult. Terrible first movie that completely killed the franchise in 2016. And now, 4 years later, still no talks of attempting to do anything else with it, despite it being a 3-book series that I would absolutely love to see adapted into a good live-action format. Compare all of these unfortunate failures to the massive success that the Harry Potter movies were, which is an excellent instance of the movies being both faithful and just well done overall. Not only did the original 8 films rack in $7.7 billion in gross income, but you've had a spin-off series that at least started decently, and a whole theme park, and let's not even think about the massive amounts made in merchandising. Comparing it to something like Percy Jackson, which those books may have not been quite as popular as Harry Potter, but they are still very, very popular. Those films only managed to survive enough to gross $430 million, which doesn't sound until you consider what could have been. All of the other movies that never got made, not to mention a successful and beloved book spin-off series that could have been adapted down the line, but it was all cut short by companies pushing out the shoddy craftsmanship of filmmaking. It is not really a secret that companies care more about the bottom dollar than making great movies, but this whole scenario that we see time and time again, the routine of killing franchises before they even start, is so short-sighted to me, and it just shows a complete disrespect to these franchises. They care more about owning the rights to their IPs and making sure others can't do something with it so that they can have the rights to any potential monetary gain off of the IP, while running it through a model that only seems to provide small temporary financial benefit, if even that. And they lose out on so much more money and material in the long term. All they seem to care about is slapping a name that people will recognize onto a film and then throwing it into the deep end and hoping that it makes a quick, cheap buck. And it is completely ridiculous to me and insulting as somebody who has seen several beloved books or shows just shredded and worn like a creepy skin suit. It is a win-win situation when companies take the time and effort to make these movies good, and it is a lose-lose situation when they don't. But it is not being treated that way. These adaptations are absolutely the movies that should be given the most attention and given the best chance to do well, and yet over and over again, they do horribly. They're not being given the care that they need and seem to be relying purely on the name that they bought that they can tack onto an absolute mess of a movie in the shallow hopes that the name enough will be enough to drive them to success. Of course, we the consumer cannot watch these movies, but that can only happen after a movie has already been made and released, and it's pretty much already dead in the water at that point. Something has to happen at the corporate level to stop stuff like this from happening over and over again, and I kinda doubt that anything like that is going to happen soon, if at all. And I know that's a little bit of a bleak note, but that's unfortunately how it seems to me. I would love to see a change in the way companies treat and handle these adaptations, but until then, we are only likely to continue to get more Artemis Fowl type movies in the future. Thank you guys for checking out the video. As I mentioned, ended up going in a very different direction from how I intended, but that is the nature of the beast sometimes. If you enjoyed, I'd appreciate it if you would consider liking the video, letting me know your thoughts below, and subscribing with notifications on. And as always, I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.